Hello and welcome to this special broadcast on the first anniversary of the dastardly attack on Israel. Gaza and Hamas fighters entered into Israel and started spraying bullets on people as early as 6:30 or 7 in the morning. To discuss what has changed since, it's my pleasure to be joined by Major Dan Pfefferman, former National Security Analyst and Advisor, IDF General Staff, as a Special Assistant to the Deputy Chief of the General Staff and a Commander in an elite intelligence unit, and also an author and researcher on Israel, Judaism, Middle East politics, and foreign affairs. Major Pfefferman, thank you so much for speaking to One India.
Thanks for having me on the show.
First things first, Major, this morning of October 7, 2024, 365 days later, what remains to be done?
Yeah, we're 1 year into this war now on multiple fronts that we never asked for, that we never wanted. And the hardest part of all of it is that 100 of our hostages are still being held in Gaza. Not clear how many of them are alive. Certainly the ones who are have been suffering an immense deal. We know from those who have been released, rescued, or unfortunately found dead. And it's been an incredibly trying period to be an Israeli. We're going to have commemoration ceremonies we had starting last night, and we're going to have over the next few days commemoration ceremonies. We essentially have not really been allowed to grieve this absolute atrocity due to the fact that our hostages are not home, due to the fact that we're still fighting in Gaza. The Lebanese arena has opened up with Hezbollah incessantly firing rockets since October 8th.
Right.
Iran has entered the fray. The Houthis in Yemen have entered the fray. Nobody in Israel knew who they were prior to this war.
Absolutely.
And the world, many in the world, it pains us so deeply to see not calling for peace, not calling for ceasefires, but chanting death to Israel, attacking Jewish communities, and I think it should surprise no one, burning flags of the nations in which they have migrated to, most ironically, and so we find ourselves at a very trying time in history.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something, even taking it further than just backstabbing. And this particular attack, obviously, reminiscent of one of the most deadliest attacks in human history, I would say. Uh, Major Pfefferman, talking about the IDF, I distinctly remember from October 7th or October 8th, I spoke to a former IDF spokesperson, to now having spoken to you and to several other spokespersons and active members there. How has it evolved? How has this war evolved the Israeli Defense Forces?
Sure, and to be clear, I am not representing the government or the military in any capacity. I'm a private citizen now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on a purely military level, one of the I hate to say bright sides when talking about war because nothing about war is bright or positive.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're doing an analysis of the threats, of the military challenges, and how the Israeli Defense Forces have answered them, it's really quite astounding. Hamas took over Gaza in 2006 after Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005 unilaterally,
Mm-hmm.
ironically in the hopes of promoting peace. And since 2006, Hamas has invested upwards of $10 billion. That number should really be stressed again. Upwards of $10 billion in turning Gaza into the most sophisticated base of terror in the world, with an array of tens of thousands of missiles, rockets, mortars. We came to discover over 500 kilometers of
Mm-hmm.
underground tunnels. So when I say underground tunnels, I'm talking 40 to 50 meters deep that crisscross the entire Gaza Strip and allow certainly the smuggling of goods, but a lifeline. They allow them to fight a protracted and sophisticated guerrilla warfare. And then, of course, their abilities and their really sophisticated plan to attack our heavily guarded border on that day, which I guess was not heavily guarded enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so the common thinking was that Israel did not go into Gaza all these years. There were 7 rounds of fighting. This was the most brutal, the one where the most the only one where really terrorists in such numbers crossed the border. But Israel had been holding off on going into Gaza for the last 20 years because the assumption was Gaza would be, so to speak, Israel's Vietnam, Israel's Afghanistan in that sense. We would get bogged down in the Gaza mud, so to speak. And the fact that 1 year in, Hamas was overwhelmingly demolished as a military organization. It's now really just guerrilla forces who are causing trouble, but there is no command structure. Almost all of the top leadership has been demolished. Their weapons manufacturing and launching abilities have been demolished, even if they fire rockets as they did this morning from time to time.
Right.
And their ability to function as a comprehensive terrorist organization has all been but taken out. Israel took over Gaza in lightning fashion, and we've lost some 500 soldiers fighting in Gaza. That's a tremendous amount for us. Every one of those is, the son, the husband, the brother of somebody in Israel. It's a small country here. This is not like India, we're a country of 10 million people, even less.
Yeah, yeah,
And yet the numbers predicted that there were going to be thousands of Israeli casualties. I have to say, there are some estimated 20,000 Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza, which again
okay.
is a large number, and we take no pride or pleasure in the fact that 20,000 roughly civilians have been killed in Gaza. Another
Mm-hmm.
20,000 are Hamas and Jihad militants. That is an extraordinarily low number of civilian casualties, especially given that Hamas's entire strategy is based on using its
Using
own civilians as
humans.
shields.
Mm-hmm.
In the north, if we shift to the northern arena, Hezbollah, the flagship Iranian proxy in the region,
Mm-hmm.
was the vaunted military organization that people said was more powerful than most states' militaries, certainly more heavily armed, had a budget of close to $1 billion a year. That's tremendous. It's certainly more than the Lebanese army. And once again, Hezbollah has been firing incessantly since October 8th, inserting itself into this war in order to weaken and distract and divide Israel, leaving close to 100,000 Israelis homeless, those who live on the northern border with Lebanon.
Right.
And here the thinking was, if Israel were to escalate, if Israel were to go into Lebanon, if Israel were to conduct more serious airstrikes beyond limited targeted attacks, it's always the number that's thrown out is 150,000 Hezbollah rockets and missiles, that force would come to bear on Israel. And what we saw in a masterful intelligence coup
Mm-hmm.
is the famous pager attack that's attributed to Israeli intelligence, which took out a good 15,000
Mm-hmm.
Hezbollah operatives, broke their entire chain of communications and command, put
Mm-hmm.
many people in the hospital, and then, of course, the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah,
Mashallah.
and
Yes.
quite literally the entire top leadership of the organization, while airstrikes over the course of the last week took out, it's estimated, well over half of
Right.
their capability to fire mid and long-term rockets in Israel. It's quite astounding to see the sheer military and intelligence superiority of Israel, and I think even many in Israel were surprised at the successes of that.
Right. Then also talking about, you're right when you talk about the dismantling of the Hamas network. Yahya Sinwar, when he planned this attack, almost, at a very personal level, very hush-hush manner, kept it secret, not even shared it with his own people there, uh, not with Hezbollah at all. When he planned this attack, what must have been going through his mind? Because he knew that he is taking on an IDF, a Mossad, a Benjamin Netanyahu who would hit back like anything and they will be wiped from the face of the earth. Why Yahya Sinwar would do this?
We in Israel, since I know I personally, as someone who frequently comments on these affairs, have
Mm.
been trying to get into the head of Yahya Sinwar and the Hamas leadership um, since that day, and we're actually incapable of doing it because to launch a terrorist attack, and you mentioned spraying bullets. If only spraying bullets was the
No,
only
it's
form, the
beyond.
kind of
Yeah.
brutalities we read
Yes.
about are
Mm-hmm.
so depraved. The kind of acts that were conducted on children, on elderly women, on pregnant women is beyond comprehension.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly of any of us in Israeli society. Certainly Yahya Sinwar, who it was aware and probably is aware of Israel's military superiority. I think he estimated that Israel was far weaker and more divided internally than it was. He saw the protests that were taking place on the streets. Of course, the timing, it was a Jewish holiday
Mm-hmm.
when many soldiers are home, when many families are away, when people are asleep. And also, there was a sense that the coming peace and normalization agreement, the Abraham Accords, were going to expand quite soon to include Saudi Arabia. And in
Yes.
such a constellation, a geopolitical constellation where Saudi Arabia signs a peace and normalization agreement with Israel, which would include, of course, a defense pact with the United States, it would include a Saudi demand to have either significant or total progress on solving the Palestinian issue together with the
State too.
Palestinian Authority.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that Sinwar and probably his backers in Tehran um, understood that this is their last chance to tank, to torpedo the upcoming Saudi deal, and also possibly upend the Abraham Accords, cause such a regional conflict, drag, of course, Hezbollah and the Houthis in, as happened. I think they were hoping to inflame the West Bank. I think they were hoping to inflame the tensions of the 20%, the nearly 2 million Israeli Arab citizens, as happened in 2021,
Mm-hmm.
and not just prevent the upcoming Saudi deal, but even undo all of the progress made with the Abraham Accords over the last 4 years. Um, and they view a long game. Their game is not a short one, and so for them, it is apparent now that death is not an obstacle in achieving their goals, and they will continue to attack and instigate wars and chaos and
Mm-hmm.
fight to every last civilian of theirs because they have shown zero regard for civilian lives. Obviously, not on Israel's side, but especially not on their own side.
Right. Then I'll take one final question from you. You mentioned about the Saudi Arabia, the deal, the proposal that was the United States mediation, but all of them pointing towards giving possibly a statehood to Palestine, which Israel is not ready for. We heard Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday giving a very impassioned speech when he directly addressed French President Macron. He said that with or without you, we are going to win this war, and your deeds would be remembered long after the uh, war is over. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, Dan, how difficult it has been to maintain that tightrope walk between military maneuvering to diplomatic stances.
Yeah, that's been the biggest challenge, and I do not envy any Israeli decision maker here.
Mhm,
How do you translate the military victories and successes, which have been quite clear, into strategic successes and restructuring the Middle East? What the Israeli military victories, first in Gaza, now what we're seeing in Lebanon, have done, um, have opened up a space for a restructuring, for a redrawing of the lines in the current Middle East.
mhm,
What we have seen over the last decade or so has been the reformation of the fault lines. If it was once the Arab nationalists versus the moderates or the pro-West governments, if it was then the Islamist governments against the
mhm,
moderates, we now have the Sunni moderates against, together with Israel, backed by the United States and other allies around the region,
Mm-hmm.
um, versus the Shia radical axis. And it's now imperative upon Israeli leaders, but also regional leaders, to cement these new fault lines with a weakened radical axis, because that's what we're really seeing. They can play a spoiler, but they can't achieve a whole lot. Macron, Prime Minister Netanyahu's statements to French President Macron and
Mm-hmm.
others is quite important. We here in Israel, we here in the Middle East, cannot capitulate to these extremes. They have no positive goals for the region. They seek only to push back the forces of moderation. They have no respect for national sovereignty. They don't have respect for borders. They don't have respect for governments. They seek war and destruction. And here, the regional powers, the Saudis and the others involved in the Abraham Accords, and I think other governments more quietly, needed to see a clear military victory by Israel, who is ironically fighting this fight against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against Iran now,
Mm-hmm.
on behalf of all of the moderate actors in this region. And World War II was 80 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but it seems that the West has forgotten what it means to fight wars that are um, essential, that are moral, that have a clear good guy and bad guy. And it seems that in the West, they have forgotten what that means.
Mm-hmm.
We unfortunately in Israel we cannot forget what those kinds of wars are, because we're faced with them on a regular basis. And so it's easy to call for a ceasefire. It's
Mm-hmm.
easy to instill arms embargoes, but we don't have that kind of luxury. Um, what we're going to need to see here is how now does Israel's leadership, and here I have to be honest with you, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
entirely confident that Israel's current leadership knows how to do that. There's a lot of domestic political tensions that will surface to the fray once again
Mm-hmm.
when the military action calms down,
Right.
and the Emiratis, and the others are going to want to see, at this point, more than just movement or lip service towards a solution with the Palestinians. And here's the tricky part of your question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, October 7th showed us, and I have to say, I was among the many Israelis who was surprised and shocked by this. With whom on the Palestinian side are we supposed to negotiate and discuss? Hamas, we had assumed quite wrongly, and we paid a heavy price for it, did
Mm-hmm.
not moderate, was not seeking stability and economic prosperity.
Correct.
They threw it all away to launch this unnecessary war that's left 20,000 Palestinian civilians dead, and Gaza in absolute ruins.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinian Authority, the supposed moderates, have not once condemned October 7th, have not once condemned Hamas. And not only that, but they completely parrot the Hamas talking points about Israeli
Right.
genocide and occupation and ethnic cleansing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to need to see some kind of a double effort for the Arabs in the region to step up,
Mm-hmm.
to build a new, real Palestinian leadership that wants to live alongside Israel and says it quite clearly. We have not seen that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there will need to be a simultaneous encouragement of Israeli leadership to accept that. In the meantime, I don't see that happening, and until then, the region is going to be stuck in a bit of a stalemate in that regard.
Absolutely, Dan. Thank you so much for actually sharing your insights. And trust me, from this part of the world, if we look at the developments and we gather information through several sources, agencies on ground, from colleagues and friends like you, it only appears to us that this 1 year has been the most gruesome year for Israel, or for that matter, anyone. But one thing is for sure, your leadership has shown immense courage and has fought for every individual who was harmed, who has been taken hostage, and the commitment that the last hostages, unless they are freed, this fight, this retaliation would continue. Dan Pfefferman, former National Secretary, analyst, and advisor to IDF General Staff. Thank you so much. for speaking to One India.
Thanks for having me on.